Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really vital topic, but one that's often kind of overlooked.
Yeah, it's about how multiple stigmatized identities or conditions, they don't just sit side by side.
Right, they actually converge and interact within people. And that has these profound impacts on health.
Exactly. It's called intersectional stigma. We've been digging into some academic sources that really shine a light on this complex area.
So our goal today is to unpack the key ideas from these sources. Why this matters, what the challenges are in studying it.
And the opportunities, too, for understanding how these layers of stigma combine and, well, affect our well-being.
Because we often look at stigmas one by one, right? Like just health stigma or just racial stigma.
But that's not the lived experience for many people. It's much more tangled, much more complex than that.
Okay, so let's define it then. Intersectional stigma. Based on the sources, it's really about this convergence.
Precisely. When someone has multiple identities or conditions that society stigmatizes, could be race, gender, maybe HIV status, even things like past substance use, how do those layers actually come together?
And the sources point out that, like, the term intersectionality itself got a huge boost from Kimberly Crenshaw back in '89. But the basic idea, analyzing how race and sex, for instance, intertwine to create unique disadvantages, that has deeper historical roots.
Absolutely. The core concept isn't brand new, but applying that lens specifically to stigma and health, that's a really critical focus right now.
So why is it so crucial? Why look at these layers together when thinking about health outcomes?
Because, well, these intersecting stigmas, they don't just add up neatly. They influence mental health, physical health, even things like health behaviors and whether people can access care. It creates this whole range of different vulnerabilities.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting, sometimes sort of counterintuitive. The effects aren't just additive. 1 plus 1 doesn't always equal 2 here. Well, they can interact, sometimes amplifying each other, making things much worse.
Okay, that makes sense.
But sometimes, surprisingly, one stigma can actually sort of dampen the impact of another one. It's complex.
That idea that they don't just add up, that really stands out. Let's look at some examples from the sources that show this. They mention studies using short scenarios, vignettes.
Yes, those vignette studies are fascinating. One source talks about how public attitudes, like wanting social distance, can change dramatically depending on the mix of stigmas.
And factors like perceived blame come into it too.
Exactly. And context matters hugely. Like one study looked at schizophrenia stigma combined with being part of a minority outgroup.
An outgroup meaning like a group seen as different or outside the mainstream.
Correct. And the effect wasn't universal. In some places, that outgroup status actually increased the stigma from schizophrenia.
What?
But in the U.S. example they cited, it did the opposite. It actually decreased the desired social distance compared to just having schizophrenia stigma alone.
Wow, okay. So the opposite of what you might intuitively predict.
Totally. It just highlights how much the specific combination and the social context matter. And this complexity isn't just in attitudes, it plays out in real health outcomes.
Right. The sources kept linking coexisting stigmas to worse health behaviors, worse results.
Definitely. There was one study mentioned looking at African Americans dealing with both racial discrimination and HIV stigma.
And the finding was?
They were less likely to disclose their HIV status and had more trouble sticking to their medication plans. A clear negative interaction.
Okay, that sounds more like an amplification effect. What about other examples?
Well, another one from Jamaica looking at LGBT individuals and HIV found something that seemed more additive. Both HIV stigma and stigma related to sexual identity were separately linked with more depressive symptoms.
So in that case, it was like both things contributed independently to the depression.
It appeared that way, yes. But then remember that study in Alabama with black men?
Yes, the one about HIV and sexual orientation discrimination.
Right. There, they found something really unexpected. Discrimination based on sexual orientation seemed to lessen the negative impact of HIV discrimination on depression.
Lessen it. How could that work?
Well, it suggests there might be some kind of resilience there, maybe through shared identity, strong community support, perhaps coping strategies developed within that community. It wasn't just additive, one seemed to buffer the other slightly.
That Alabama finding really drives home the challenges here.
Yeah.
How do researchers even measure these complicated, sometimes non-additive effects? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. And honestly, there's no single agreed upon method right now. People are trying different things.
Like what?
qualitative studies, so in-depth interviews to really understand people's lived experiences, and then complex statistical methods on the quantitative side.
Stuff like moderation analysis.
Exactly. Things like moderation, latent variable analysis, tools that try to capture effects that aren't just simple addition, trying to see how one factor changes the impact of another.
So looking ahead, a big need is better measurement tools.
Absolutely. Developing better ways to measure and analyze this is key, but also understanding the mechanisms. Why do they interact this way?
And how does it differ across conditions, cultures?
Yes, all of that. And crucially, learning from examples like that Alabama study, we need more research on the positive side.
The resilience aspect.
Exactly. How shared identity, community, solidarity, how can these act as protective factors? We need to understand that better.
That feels really important. So if we were to sort of boil it down, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive for you, for the listener?
I think it's that intersecting stigmas are, well, they're a common reality for a lot of people, and their impact on health is really significant and complex. It's not simple addition.
So we need a more nuanced approach, looking at the whole person, their multiple experiences.
Precisely. Not just viewing stigmas in isolation.
And the sources also hint that, alongside all the vulnerability this stigma creates, there can be real strength found in those shared experiences too.
Right. Which maybe leaves us with a thought to ponder. Given that power of shared identity and community we saw glimpses of, how can we sort of intentionally harness that?
Harness the protective factors.
Yeah. How can we build on that strength to actively reduce the health burden that comes from these intersecting stigmas?
Thinking about strength in shared journeys.
Mm.
That's a powerful place to end.